So we're going to shift to the Pacific and take a look at the strategies and tactics that U.S. forces employed during the Pacific campaign. I know we haven't talked about that yet. So take a second, start a new quad chart with this essential question, and the lesson is advancing on Japan. This quote's interesting from the General Kiribashi of the Imperial Japanese Army. Kiribashi had spent a lot or a good portion of his career working in the United States and Canada. He was infinitely familiar with Americans and American tactics. And he made this comment actually at a dinner party in America when being talked about the potential for war with Japan. He thought that the United States is the last country in the world that we should fight. And he really believed that. And ultimately, Kiribashi becomes the general we do have to fight on the island of Iwo Jima. And we'll talk about him a little bit more toward the end of this lecture. But essentially at the beginning, we're just starting to really get out in the Pacific and see some combat. Our troops are starting to become seasoned. We are pouring in resources on our different bases out there. And one of those resources is, the new aircraft carriers capable of carrying 100 aircraft each, 27-ton carriers. So nothing like the Japanese have had. And an upgrade to our Independence class carriers is the F-6F Hellcat fighter, which is a lighter, more maneuverable, and much more dynamic aircraft than the P-51, which we had been fighting with. This aircraft is superior to the Japanese Zeros, really outmaneuvers them and gives the American pilots a significant advantage. One of the difference between the P-51 and the F-6 is that the P-51 had four 7.62 millimeter machine guns and two 50 calibers. This one's got six 50 caliber machine guns. It fires a rate of 1,200 rounds per minute. So not only can it outmaneuver the Zeros, but it can shoot them down in significant better fashion than the P-51 could. Our strategy is to occupy significant islands that we can use for the B-29 Super Fortress. That's our big weapon that we're going to take to take out the Japanese mainland. We then want to bomb the Japanese forces into submission. Here's a picture of the B-29. The B-29 is the most expensive weapon system developed during World War II. And really, $1.7 billion spent on a B-29. That's more than we spent on the nuclear program. Adjusted for inflation in today's dollars, this would have costed $40 billion. One of the significant aspects of it is that this can fly 31,000 feet in the air. That's above the height that the Japanese Zeros can get to shoot it down. It's also got six machine gun turrets. You can see a turret up here. There's a turret there, a turret underneath, and you can see another turret right there on the back of the tail. And these were all manned from inside the cockpit. So somebody sat in the cockpit with a joystick and a camera and can control the firing mechanisms without actually putting a person inside of each one of those turrets. We didn't take all of the islands. That's where the idea of leapfrogging came from. So we took islands that were key and significant. They needed to have an airfield that we could use. It needed to be an area we could stage a base on for logistics. But if we didn't need the island, for the most part, we bypassed them, cut them off, and many of those Japanese soldiers were left out there to fend for themselves and potentially starving. The first major battle we're going to get into on the ground out there is the Battle of Saipan. Admiral Nimitz is moving his fleet along the north, and General MacArthur is moving in a second fleet among the south, going toward the Philippines. Here's Saipan near the Marinara Islands right there. The strategic value, like the other islands that we were taking, is that it had a airfield that was really critical to our aircraft as we were going to attack the Japanese main islands, and we were going to use it as a logistical supply point. So these islands didn't take a whole lot of effort by the Marines to take over. Just a couple of weeks throughout the entire campaign to take Saipan, Guam, and Tinian, but a significant interaction. So 535 ships, 127,000 troops, near simultaneous within a few days apart. Were invading on those islands. The Japanese at this point in time have pulled back off the beaches, and they started digging into the terrain and then tried to carry out these banzai attacks. For the first time, we see suicide attacks by the Japanese. And the mass attacks in Saipan fail. They were designed to kill 7 Americans for every Japanese death. It didn't work out to their advantage that way. And ultimately, the Marines did occupy that island. The next naval battle is the Battle of the Philippine Sea. And it becomes the last major carrier versus carrier engagement of World War II. Here you can see what each of the naval forces brought to bear in that battle were. And at the same time, we decide to invade the Marianas Islands. So we do that. Here's the Marianas. And then the Battle of the Philippine Sea happens just to the west of there. And again, it's a carrier versus carrier battle. So our aircraft are out spotting the other ships, conducting primarily operations from air to sea. And our pilots really show the advantage of the F-6 at this point in time by having a 15-to-1 kill ratio over the Japanese Zeros. Here you can see what was lost at the end of that. And the Japanese Navy is no longer able to carry out any large-scale operations. We haven't defeated the Navy yet, but it's not able to carry out any large-scale operations. Now, the Battle of Peleliu is a really strategically insignificant battle. It was hotly discussed, potentially unnecessary operation where we suffer a great deal of casualties. And perhaps because we suffered a lot of casualties there is why, in hindsight, it was looked at as strategically insignificant. There's a great book about this battle called, there's 2 books, With the Old Breed and A Helmet for My Pillow, that documents what happened. And they were made into a HBO miniseries called The Pacific, which is really good if you ever get a chance to watch that. But essentially, the Marines are going to assault and take over this airfield. They hit it with preparatory attack by naval gunfire. They destroy all of the aircraft. All of the vegetation is gone. There's no place to hide or get shade on this island anymore before the Marines go in. And something else is they didn't have any fresh water on the island. So the Marines cleaned out fuel cans on the Navy ships that had been used for petroleum, and they filled it with fresh water and took it ashore. And then when they would dip the water, their canteens or canteen cups in, there would be a layer of oil floating on top of the water. So a lot of them got sick on the island. It was just a really, really horrible experience for most of them. And there's some really, really good stories in both of those books. If you get a chance to either watch that series or read the books. We really see war in its brutality displayed in the Pacific, unlike what we've seen yet. The Japanese were well prepared. They started digging in specific positions without any front line that could be identified. So the Marines had to go from position to position and root out the Japanese. The Marine commander believes that they could take this island in 4 days, and it just doesn't happen or go the way that he plans because of the well-entrenched Japanese soldiers. Here's really some significant challenges. Rough terrain. It's a coral reef island, so it's really hard to dig in around a lot of those rocks without giving specific time to do it. So the Marines couldn't dig hasty fighting positions very well. They had to fight across open ground that had been destroyed by artillery. The Japanese positions were concealed, and they had to find them and root them out. And then the complete change in what the Japanese are doing, almost psychological. Perhaps they knew that they weren't going to win. There were no reinforcements coming, right? So at this point in time, they're not going to surrender. It's still that warrior society we talked about at the very beginning of this unit, but they just begin kill for the sake of killing. And we experienced the highest amount of casualties to date of any battle in World War II, 9,000. The Japanese think that they can still get one decisive naval battle and get back into it, but they're lacking oil and resources, and it's almost impossible for them to do anything other than harassing operations. They decide they're not going to surrender under any circumstances. So on many of these islands, they initiate these mass banzai charges where men would just strap either tank mines or explosives to themselves or even hand grenades, and they would run and charge in mass. Hundreds, sometimes thousands of Japanese soldiers would just run at the American forces and explode these bombs or grenades and try to kill Americans at the same time. The Japanese merchant ship, also significant in keeping these islands manned and fed. has been destroyed. So our Navy now switches focus from solely destroying the Japanese Navy to also finding the merchant fleet and destroying any type of logistical supply that the Japanese can provide. And the result is that a lot of these men are starving on the islands that they're occupying. Moving to the Philippine campaign, this is General MacArthur's, big goal. He wants to liberate the Philippines. He swore that he would be back when the Japanese ran him out of there, and he moved his command to Australia. And they find that, the Japanese forces are well prepared for this attack, but we're still going to move in and conduct that attack. And they initially do it with a naval attack at the Leak Gulf. Here again, you see MacArthur's fleet going in the south, Admiral Nimitz's fleet taking it a northern route going towards Japan. Battle of Leak Gulf, as I started mentioning, we start out with this for the U.S. and significantly less for the Japanese Navy. At the same time, the U.S. fleet is now attacking the Japanese fleet while it's supporting ground operations that are going on in the Philippines. The Japanese Navy and the Japanese Air Forces switch tactics. And like we've seen with the Banzai attacks with the Japanese soldiers, we start seeing Banzai or kamikaze attacks with the Japanese aircraft. And this starts at Operation Show 1. Show means victory. So they believed that they would be victorious, and the last weapon that they had that they could possibly use was airplanes, that after the Japanese would have dropped their bombs and ordnance toward the fleet, they would just fly into it and try to destroy American ships. During this, Admiral Halsey was lured away from the main force, and the Japanese Navy potentially could have attacked supply and transport ships, but Admiral Kurita thought he was being lured into an ambush, so he went away, really making a tactical error when the U.S. fleet was somewhat isolated, and the Japanese could have scored a quick victory. Here's the result of the Battle of the Leak Gulf. Obviously, the Japanese destroy a significant amount of the Americans, but they just don't have enough of their own to continue going at this pace. And ultimately, we get into Luzon, and total liberation of the Philippines is achieved, just like General MacArthur promised. Here's a shot of MacArthur, probably staged, right? But coming back into the Philippines with his staff. And another shot of these massive transport ships that I talked about toward the end of the D-Day lesson. Great big flat bottom ships carry troops, carry lots of equipment. You have to have a nice flat beach to get in and bring this stuff into. And, the Philippines offered that, just like the beaches at Normandy had offered that. So the last battle we'll talk about today is the Battle of Iwo Jima. And unfortunately, because of the format that we're in, we're not going to be able to spend a week watching letters from Iwo Jima. But I would highly recommend, if you get a chance, to watch that movie. It's produced by Clint Eastwood, and it really follows Lieutenant General Kiribashi's career in America. And then as he goes back to Japan and takes over command on Iwo Jima, he brings a completely different tactical understanding of how to defend an island that was not popular among those in his command, but honestly was very successful for what he was trying to do. So Iwo Jima is very close to the Japanese main islands. So you had two big battles, Okinawa and Iwo Jima, that were very close, probably the closest and most significant to Japan. It is Japanese territory, and nobody had occupied Japanese territory in over 5,000 years. So them holding on to this was not only tactical, but also ceremonial. It had two airfields, so it was a great location to put our B-29 and its escort fighters that can get in and bomb Tokyo and bomb other cities in Japan. Again, Kiribashi commands the defense, and he puts in a defense in-depth system like nobody has ever done. He pulls all the beach defenses back. And this is where the big argument comes with his staff. They didn't understand why why they weren't going to defend with pillboxes on the beaches. And as he arrived, he sees what's going on and how they're building, and he pulls them back. And he says, we're going to dig into the mountain, a great big volcano that's there. And we're going to make the Americans come inside the mountain to fight us there. So great strategy, very difficult fighting in that type of terrain. And ultimately he rescinds a little bit and he lets some of those pillboxes stay out there. But his defense and depth strategy was really at this point in the war the best that we've seen. What he does is he conducts all these different tunnels, 1,500 rooms. They could pop out where the American forces were approaching, fire some machine guns, retreat back into the mountain. Just like in other places, Kuribashi knew there were not going to be any survivors. By this time, the majority of the Japanese Navy had been destroyed. They were combat ineffective. A lot of the aircraft had been called back to be used as kamikazes from the mainland in case we did attack Japan. So his goal, it was increasing from before, that every Japanese soldier would kill 10 Americans before finally going to his death. The Marines request 10 days of pre-invasion bombardment. They're granted for, really insignificant because the bombing didn't do any damage because the majority of the equipment and all the people were well underground in Mount Suribachi. Here's a look at the mountain range or the volcano on Iwo Jima. It's a massive inactive volcano, and they dug deep inside of it. And the Americans would pick this area right in here as their flat landing zone. You can see the ships in there. So after the battle has taken place, Kuribashi walks the terrain and he knows where the Americans are going to attack, which is why he chooses Suribachi as an area to draw them to and fight. And on the other side of the island, there are more mountains and more tunnel complexes. So potentially the Americans have to fight on two fronts as they get into the island. They deployed several thousand troops, 110,000 troops coming in, 880 ships. You could see it, the armada from miles away. Kuribashi is exactly right in where the Americans were going to land. They had to take Mount Suribachi, and they also had to move all the way across the island with multiple belts of obstacles and fighters dug in underground for the Americans to have to root out. Another thing, the island had erupted before, the volcano had erupted on the island before, so the surface of the island is black volcanic ash. It looks like black sand, but there's just no structure to it. You can't put it in sandbags and have any type of cover provided for it because it's so light. You can't dig in it, a hasty fighting position. If you start digging, it just kind of falls in on itself. So very little cover from the Japanese forces, and they're always within range of Japanese machine gun fire from the time they get on the island until the time it's over. They win, or they do this by having numerical superiority, right? So the Japanese are not getting any reinforcements. There's only 21,000 Japanese soldiers. It takes some time, but the final last charge on the northern side of the island is a mass suicide banzai attack led by General Kuribashi himself. And rumor has it that he was wounded mortally on that banzai attack, and that a soldier of his took him aside and buried him because his body has never been found. It was never recovered with everybody else, and he never escaped to make it back to Japan. So he led that banzai attack and ultimately died with the majority of his men on Iwo Jima. Was it a good battle? Yeah, I think so. I mean, was it worth the sacrifice? 2,400 B-29 missions landed there. Several aircraft that had been shot and damaged have landed there. It saved thousands of American airmen lives. One in the middle of the Battle of Iwo Jima, we'd taken part of the island, and they allowed an aircraft to fly in and land there, get repaired actually while we were still fighting, and take off and get out of there. So a significant battle, a lot of casualties on both sides, but very, very detrimental to the Japanese. Put us within striking range of, again, with B-29 striking range of Tokyo, and very close to ending the war with Japan.